Now, I don't know if you know this, but did you know that one of McDonald's, you know the restaurant, one of McDonald's goals is to be consistent. And so wherever you go, a Big Mac is a Big Mac. It's the same. And in fact, when they have expanded their restaurant into new areas, in some places they've even gone in and developed agriculture in those areas so that they can continue to be consistent. And so they make sure that everything is in place so their restaurants are the same, or so their food, that those Big Macs are the same. Now, I may not go to McDonald's very often, but when I do, I know exactly what to expect. Now, I know there's some differences in some foreign countries, but you know what I mean. Consistency is good. But then there's this. Years ago, when I used to do remodeling and carpentry, I went to Home Depot a lot. And when I walked into Home Depot, I knew exactly where everything was. But then things changed. I remember the first time I walked into a store and I was like, something's wrong here. The entire store was backwards. You know, that aisle should be over there and that aisle should be over there, but it was backwards. But at least I could still figure it out. It was just backwards. But then they continued to change. And nowadays you go into stores and every store could be different. In fact, there are some here in town. They're very different from each other. And it seems like every time I go into Home Depot or any store like that now, at some point I think, well, I used to know where to find this, and I wander all over the store looking for it. It's a lot harder now. Consistency is good. And speaking of consistency, what about God? Is God consistent? Is he good? Is he faithful? Does he do what's right? Does he keep his promises? Always. But what about people? Is that true of us? Are we consistent? And do we always do what's right? Sadly, no. We may want to, but we often fall short. And even Abraham, the great hero of faith, struggled with this as well. He sinned. He wasn't always faithful. But the good thing is that God always is. God is consistently faithful. So if we do well, God is faithful. And if we fail, well, God is still faithful. And that makes all the difference. Consistency is good. But as we continue to look at Abraham's life, we remember his moments of great faith and his obedience and his concern for righteousness and justice. And we also remember a couple lapses in faith. And then we come to this next event in his life. And when we read it, we think, oh no, not that again. Look at chapter 20 and verse 1. From there, Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. And he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarai, his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. Now, wait a minute. Didn't we already read this? Didn't we read this a few weeks ago? Well, no, but this is very similar to what we read a few weeks ago. And Abraham did the same thing twice, okay? And so he's moving again, but he's not in Egypt this time. He's actually, this time he's in an area that is within the promised land. He's camping out near a Philistine city. But he goes to this new area, and again he tells people that Sarah is his sister. And then the king of Gerar takes Sarah to be one of his wives. And you read this and you're like, how did this happen again? Well, let's talk about that. First, remember, why is it that Abraham tells people she is my sister? It's because he's scared. He is afraid that the men of that area will want his wife as their own and will kill him to get her. And so he's got this simple solution. Well, just tell them, you're my sister. In other words, let's just deceive them or tell a half-truth. Of course, it doesn't seem to work. He's alive. He hasn't been killed, but Sarah gets taken twice. But this is Abraham's, we could call it his fallback sin. It's that thing that comes easy. Maybe he's not even thinking about it anymore. They just go into the new area and this is what they say. It's just what he does. And when he's in an uncertain situation, this is his go-to. But is it right? Well, no. But you know where this problem all starts, right? It's when he fails to trust God. And think about this. He has every reason to trust God and no reason not to. And think about his life. God has made him promises, and God has kept those promises. God has already blessed him with a lot of animals and a lot of wealth. God has protected him and has given him victory over those 4 kings that came down and conquered Sodom and took Lot. And Abraham went and chased after him, and God gave him the victory. And in a very similar situation to this, God had protected him from Pharaoh, rescued them, Abraham and Sarah from Pharaoh. And then this is the big one. After all of that, we just read this last week, God came and he just now confirmed his promise to Abraham that he would have a son through or with his wife Sarah. So the two of them would have a son, and he gave him a time frame. He said, within this next year. So he should, at this point, he should have complete confidence that nothing could happen to either of them. They have to be together in order for that promise to come true, right? They have to both be alive. And so he should have confidence that God is going to protect them for that promised child to be born. But Abraham's fear gets the best of him. And this man of faith still lacks faith. And he lets his fear lead him to sin rather than lead him to God. So he's afraid, he fails to trust God, and with this lack of faith, he returns to his old ways. But his scheming and his dishonesty don't end well for him. So Abraham, he hides the truth. Abimelech takes Sarah as for himself, and now God will have to step in again. Look at verse 3. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, "Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman you have taken, for she is a man's wife." Now, Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, "Lord, will you kill an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, 'She is my sister'? And she herself said, 'He is my brother'? In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands I have done this." Then God said to him in the dream, "Yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not return her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours." So Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told them all these things, and the men were very much afraid. So now Abimelech, he seems to be a God-fearer in a sense. I don't mean that he necessarily believed in and worshiped the true God, but he does believe there is a God, and he understands that he's speaking to God, and he is very respectful towards God. But he also recognizes that God would be righteous, that he would do what is right. And he is he's truly concerned with doing what is right. Abimelech is doing what is morally right, and he's quite literally afraid of God at this point. He knows that God can do what he has threatened to do here in this dream. And so God appears to Abimelech in this dream, and he says, "You're a dead man," which is basically like saying, "You're as good as dead." And the reason is that he has taken another man's wife to be his own. And there are two serious problems here, actually. But only one of them is spoken of by God here. But one of the problems is that God has promised Abraham a son through Sarah. And Abraham's actions have put that promise in jeopardy. And it's just about time for Isaac their son, to be conceived. But Sarah has been taken away. And now it would even be possible of her becoming pregnant by Abimelech. That would be an issue. This was a bad situation, but God steps in and stops it from happening. But God doesn't even bring this up here. He focuses in on the moral issue. And this is the other serious problem. Taking another man's wife is adultery. It's wrong. And Abimelech immediately sees this problem. He understands that this is totally wrong. And notice, he doesn't argue and say, "I didn't do anything wrong." He admits that he's done this wrong, but he didn't know that he was doing wrong. This is what he means when he says, "I did that." He did it in the integrity of his heart. He honestly didn't know that she was married. Abraham had deceived him. So he didn't purposefully do anything wrong. You see, it was Abraham's sin that got Abimelech in trouble here. I want you to think about that. Our sin is always against God. And sometimes our sin against God may not affect anyone else but me and God. But at other times, our sin, and probably quite often, your sin actually can affect other people. And that's what we see here. But Abimelech pleads his case before God. He says that he was deceived. But when he pleads this case, he appeals to God's character. Just like Abraham had when he was asking God not to destroy the righteous who were in Sodom. And so Abimelech appeals to justice. He assumes that God is just and that he won't wrongly judge innocent people. And he's right. And God tells him that he knows how this all went down, how it all happened. He knows that he is innocent, that he was not doing anything wrong in his own heart. But not only that, God says that he kept Abimelech from actually committing adultery with her. And so we're told right away that Abimelech had not approached her. And so he had taken Sarah into his harem, but had no sexual contact with her. And so God had kept things from progressing in the wrong direction. But now Abimelech has to do what is right. See, he hadn't known that Sarah was Abraham's wife, but now he does. So now he has to do the right thing, and he has to restore her to her husband. If not, he is then guilty. If he doesn't make things right, he will be punished for this wrong and for disregarding God. So his only hope of survival is to return Sarah to her husband. So what does Abimelech do? Well, we're told he rose early in the morning. In other words, he obeys God right away. And when he tells his servants about this, they're all afraid because they are all in danger. So Abimelech has to fix this. Look at verse 9. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, "What have you done to us? And how have I sinned against you that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done." And Abimelech said to Abraham, "What did you see that you did this thing?" Abraham said, "I did it because I thought, there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, 'This is the kindness you must do me. At every place to which we come, say of me, he is my brother.'" Sounds like they may have done this more than twice. But twice she got taken. And so, but Abimelech comes and he kind of lays into Abraham. I mean, he calls him out for what he has done and for misleading them and putting them in danger. And so God's covenant partner, God's prophet, is being reprimanded by someone who is not in covenant relationship with God. This seems backwards, doesn't it? God's people ought to be godly and have integrity and do what's right. And you know, if the world has more integrity than people in the church, that's a real problem. So when Abraham is called out, he confesses, but he also makes excuses or tries to justify his sin. Well, she really is my half-sister. And God brought me here where I'm living as an outsider, and so I do this in order to protect myself. But these things don't excuse or justify Abraham's actions. He was wrong, and he didn't trust God. And we kind of marvel at the fact that Abraham does this a second time. We can't believe he didn't learn his lesson. But aren't we a lot the same? Don't we do these things like this too? I mean, maybe not go around saying my wife is my sister, but we sin. And then we confess it, and we agree that it's not right, and then we go and do it again. Do you have a fallback sin? You know, one that you repeat, one that just comes so easily. And maybe it's a sin that seems to come out of nowhere. Maybe when you're tired or stressed. Maybe there's a temptation that rises up when you're alone or when you're scared or upset. If there is, we need to recognize those things in ourselves. Recognize that that temptation comes. Recognize it and ask God to help you. And then guard against it. If you know in that situation, I have this temptation, guard against that situation. And if that situation is unavoidable, know that you're going into it and pray to God and ask Him to help you be faithful. And when you get caught in some sin, don't excuse it and try to justify it. Our pride, even when we're talking to God, sometimes you're just like, I messed up and I knew it, but I was, whatever. I was sick. I was tired. I was busy. I was stressed. We can easily try and make excuses for our sin. Just confess it. It was wrong. It was sin. Humbly confess it and move on. Get things right with God and faithfully follow him. And what does God promise? It's in 1 John 1:9. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. I am so glad that God is always faithful, even when we are not. In fact, God is always faithful. Let's keep reading. Verse 14. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and, I'm in the wrong chapter. Chapter 20, verse 14. Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male servants and female servants and gave them to Abraham and returned Sarah, his wife, to him. And Abimelech said, "Behold, my land is before you. Dwell where it pleases you." To Sarah he said, "Behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is a sign of your innocence in the eyes of all who are with you. And before everyone you are vindicated." Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and also healed his wife and his female slaves so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. And so God has protected his promise here. He has kept it from being compromised, even though Abraham messed up. So Abimelech, after receiving God's warning, he returns Sarah to Abraham and then gives Abraham lots of gifts too. He gives him animals, and he gives Abraham freedom to live anywhere he wants inside of his land, and he gives him 1,000 pieces of silver, and that is a lot of money. I read that the normal bride price was about 50. But not only that, it would take a common laborer 167 years to earn that much money. So he gave him a lot of money here. See, God is keeping his promise, right? God is blessing Abraham even though he doesn't deserve it here. That's God's grace. But why does Abimelech give these gifts? It's not to make up for anything he did wrong, but there's two reasons. First, it's because of Abraham and Sarah's relationship with God. And so he gives them these gifts in order to honor God. And secondly, he gave the money to publicly show his innocence and Sarah's purity, that nothing happened between them. He's restoring her honor. She was married and he took her, so he is making restitution and making a strong statement that nothing happened between them. And it's interesting, though, that he refers to Abraham as her brother. Now, on one hand, this may just simply be because in situations like this, the man would deal with the woman's father or brother. On the other hand, and I think this might be what's happening here, he may be taking one last jab at Abraham for deceiving him. It's Abraham's fault. Well, then Abraham prays for Abimelech and his household, and they are healed and now able to conceive children again. But you might wonder, why did Abraham need to pray for him, though? I mean, God stopped them from being able to have kids without Abraham doing anything. So why didn't God just reverse it now? It's because Abraham is God's covenant partner and God's prophet. And God is confirming Abraham's relationship with him. And God is now blessing people through Abraham as he promised. Remember the promise he gave to Abraham? You will be a I will bless you, and through you I will bless all people. So God is actually blessing people through Abraham as he promised. And so also, after Abraham prays for him, everything is fixed. And so this makes it evident that God has the power to make people infertile and fertile. And this also reminds them then that God can do what he has promised to Abraham and Sarah and give them a son. Ironically, though, Sarah is still barren. Abraham can pray for others to have children, but he must wait on God for his own son. Wait for God in God's time. Well, let's continue reading. Chapter 21, verse 1, it says, "The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, 'God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me.' And she said, 'Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children?'" I always think that's funny because every time I read it, I want to say, well, God did. But anyways, "Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." So it says that God visited Sarah. This means that he actively intervened in her life. Whenever this word visited is used, it refers to God coming either in help or in judgment. And so God kept his promise. He miraculously gave Sarah the ability to conceive after she was too old to conceive children. And so she gave birth to a son just as God said. He said, "This time next year, she will have a son." And so they named him Isaac. And this name that would remind them of their laughing and disbelief now also reminds them of their great joy from his miraculous birth. And then Isaac was circumcised. And this is an important little note here because it tells us that Abraham, after his little failure of faith, his little lapse, Abraham is again living in obedience to God. But we see here that God protected the promise. And then he fulfilled his promise because God is faithful. And sometimes we may have to wait a long time. But if God promised something, it will happen. And even though we, like Abraham, are clearly not perfect, God is perfectly faithful. God gives us what we don't deserve, and he keeps his promises. Even though we fail to be faithful over and over, God is always faithful. And because we know this is true, we can trust him even when it's hard. Look at verse 8. "And the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on that day, on the day when Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, 'Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac.' And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, 'Be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring.'" So Isaac was weaned. He would have been weaned when he was about 3 years old. In that culture at that time, there was a high infant mortality rate. But if a child made it to the age of 3, then the danger had pretty much passed. And so at this time, when they're weaned, they have a party to celebrate. But when they're celebrating Isaac, Sarah notices Ishmael laughing. But he's not, Ishmael, you have to recognize, is about 16 at this time. I think a lot of times we still think of him as a little boy. But he's 16, which in that culture is a man. But he's 16. And this isn't him just laughing and having a good time. But he is laughing at Isaac in a mocking way. You see, Sarah sees the same condescension and the same contempt that she saw in Hagar years earlier. And she immediately acts to protect Isaac's position in the family. You see, Isaac is the promised son, and he was to inherit the promise. The promise was to pass through him. And so she tells Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away. This means that Hagar would be freed and Ishmael would be disinherited. Abraham doesn't like this idea, and that's understandable. Not because it's wrong, but because he loves Ishmael. I mean, Ishmael's his son, and he has raised him for 16 years. This would sound like a terrible idea to any good father. But God agrees with Sarah and says, do what she says. But then he also comforts Abraham with a promise that God will bless Ishmael too. So he's telling him, Ishmael will be okay. We continue reading verse 14. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him, a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, let me not look on the death of my child, or the child. And she sat opposite him. She lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. And so we read here that Abraham rose early. In other words, he obeys right away. And even though it's hard, he obeys. He trusts God to care for Ishmael. He trusts God to bless Ishmael. And he gives Hagar and Ishmael food and sends them away. And on their journey, they run out of water, and Hagar basically gives up. She leaves Ishmael in the shade of a plant and goes far enough away that she can't hear him cry. And he couldn't hear her cry. Although she couldn't hear him, God hears him. And he assures Hagar of the promise. Remember, he had already promised Hagar once a long time ago. When he told Hagar, go back to Sarah, he said, your son, you're going to have a lot of descendants. But he assures Hagar of the promise and that they will be okay. And then we're given this little summary of Ishmael's life that shows us that God kept his promise. I mean, Ishmael became an expert with the bow and arrow. So he's a capable hunter. He's able to protect himself. He got married, which fits with God's promise of many descendants. So Ishmael will survive, and he will flourish. But when we think about Abraham's life, Abraham has shined at times. He's been a great example, and he's failed miserably at other times. Right now, he's doing well. He's obeying, and he's faithful, and he's trusting God, even when it's hard. But he is about to face his greatest test ever. We'll talk about that next week. But today, let's consider this idea of consistency. Specifically, consistent faithfulness, of always being faithful. When someone or something is consistent, you know what to expect because it's always the same. So consistency is good. Let me give you a couple examples. What would you prefer? Would you prefer to have a car that you know will always start every time you turn the key, or a car that sometimes starts? Or as a parent or a grandparent, if your kid approaches a dog and is going towards a dog to pet it, and the owner says, "Oh, go ahead, it's fine," he usually doesn't bite. Usually or never. Consistency is good. Now, just this last week, I read about a Christian man who died a few years ago. After his death, people described him as a godly man who did what was right, whether people liked it or not. And he helped a lot of people. It sounds like he was consistently faithful. And his life made an impact on his world. And one of his friends said this at his funeral. He said, "It hurts so much because the world has lost a righteous man, and that is no small thing." Consistency is good. Well, I would love if somebody said that at my funeral. Consistency is good. And this is the challenge for us today, to be consistently faithful. So, what would consistent faithfulness look like in your life? And what gets in the way of it? Maybe you have a particular sin to avoid. Maybe you need to commit to do the right thing no matter what other people think or say or the way they look at you. Maybe it means coming to church every Sunday. Maybe it means reading your Bible, praying, maybe serving God regularly, sharing your faith, encouraging others, discipling other people, coming alongside them and mentoring them in the faith. Think about it. What would consistent faithfulness look like in your life? It's our desire to be faithful, but sometimes we fall short. But our encouragement and our motivation is that God is always faithful. Even when we mess up, He remains faithful. Consistency is good. So let's be consistently faithful.